if you think that the Bible is inspired or revelatory or valuable in some way, then we need to take it for what it is. And what it is produced by a bunch of scholars who read all the manuscripts and created a critical edition, and then by a group of translators who took that edition and turned it into whatever vernacular language you're reading. So if we're going to think the Bible is important, we have to think the manuscripts and all their variety are important, and the change is a basic structure of what the Bible is, just like anything else that's important.
And it's pretty hard to find a pure version of the Bible that doesn't have something in the margin somewhere. I mean, our earliest papyri, I mean, it's not as though they were written the day after, Jesus died or anything like that. Like, we're already going quite far forward before we have our earliest evidence for the New Testament, right?
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guests are Garrick Allen and Kimberley Fowler. I have not had the opportunity to interview more than one person as many times as I would like. I think this is the second. Yeah, looking at my tracker here, Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner were the first. This is the second. As of this recording, I've done 3. Potentially, there will be more on the way. I just want you to know I'm trying to develop a new skill set of not just facilitating a conversation where I'm inviting someone to speak and open up and stretch their legs here on the podcast. It is a completely different skill set to sit down and hold up a conversation with 2 people. And I am lucky with the 3 that I've recorded so far that they all have chemistry with one another. And it's not just a coincidence that they produced something together. They can actually cooperate. So I feel like I benefit from that, and it cuts down on the workload. And it cuts down on the workload for me as a host and an interviewer. So, with that said, please subscribe, follow the podcast, leave reviews, ratings, whatever it is, wherever you're listening. I would really appreciate that. That goes a long way to helping me. Or you can use social media, the various sites that are out there. That you could follow the podcast or engage in conversations or just know who I've been interviewing recently, because I try to put that out the day of an interview. YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Threads, Twitter. I publish the episodes on WordPress and Tumblr. I push this out to as many places as I can. And, the podcast is available. Not sure where you're listening, but the podcast is available: Apple, Spotify, Audible, and then a dozen places that I'd never even heard of until I started producing a podcast, like Podbean, which is where, at least for the time being, I host the website, and they are also a podcast platform. So many places to subscribe and rate and like and give feedback. Or if you're feeling really generous, $5 a month gets you episodes about 10 days before they come out for free. And keep in mind, they only come out for free in audio format. So that is done. I will be back at the end of the episode to set up next week's episode. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Garrick Allen and Kimberley Fowler. Garrick Allen and Kimberley Fowler, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so we'll start Garrick and then go Kimberley. Before we get going, will you each tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Garrick. I work at the University of Glasgow. From Seattle originally. I had planned to be the shortstop for the Seattle Mariners, um, but turns out I wasn't very good at baseball. So here I am working on manuscripts and other things.
And I'm Kim. I work at a university in the Netherlands, the University of Groningen, where I teach New Testament and early Christianity. And like Garrick, interested in manuscripts, not just biblical ones. I also work with apocryphal material as well. And yeah, early Christianity is a very broad phenomenon.
I will note, and maybe Kim doesn't know this, but what Garrick just said is the first time I've ever heard someone who wanted to be a pro baseball player and isn't, that did not offer an excuse as to why that didn't happen. That's
Oh
the
yeah,
first straightforward.
I'm just not very good at baseball, turns out. So that's the problem.
Okay,
Me neither, to be
but you
fair.
still love it, right?
Oh, totally. It's the one thing that I still follow in America is Major League Baseball. So it's the
Okay.
one thing I miss about America.
How do you? I mean, how difficult is it to get access to the games?
Oh, it's not hard. I just can't stay up that late because of my kids. So I can catch an East Coast day game and watch the whole thing. So that's what I wait for.
I can understand not being able to stay up late, but my kids are not old enough for me to have to go to bed early. I just am middle aged and I can't stay up late anymore.
I'm with you, man. I'm with
Yeah.
you.
Okay, so we're discussing today the two of you collaborated on a Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Story of Codex H, Manuscript Migration and Primary Sources in Biblical Studies. And so the textual reception thing, text criticism thing, I've mentioned him a couple of times in chatting with Kim before we started here, and well, chatting with both of you before we started here. My friend Daniel, he described text critics as among biblical scholars who are nerds, like the nerdiest nerds, like the king nerds. And I have to say, like, I mean that with all respect and love and affection, because these are the most interesting concepts, because it really does start to tear apart some assumptions that I had growing up hearing about Bible, and you hear about, oh, well, the original texts are this or that, and you always associate it with our understanding of publishing. So, and so like we kind of agreed before we started, we'll start with Garrick, but if the two of you could kind of walk through, what is the story of why for this article that you worked on together?
Mm. Yes, I mean, there's a number of answers to that question. I mean, practically, Kim and I were working on a larger project together that was funded by the UK government on this manuscript in particular. Has a a number of unique features in history that we wanted to explore further, but also this broader tradition that it was a part of the Euthalian tradition, which is this set of prefaces and lists and cross references and things like this that exist in over 600 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that very few people have worked with ever. So we wanted to sort of map that. So this is our sort of attempt to tell the story of Codex H the best we can, at least back, kind of walk backward from where its pages are today back to, the 10th century for sure, and try to start to push beyond that and think about why the history of one of, many thousands of copies of the Greek New Testament matters for what it is we do more broadly.
Yeah, and since we started by talking about textual criticism, I'll use that as a sort of jumping off point here as well. It is very, very important, and it underpins much of the scholarship that we do in the New Testament. But for a lot of us, what we are also, in some cases, more interested in, but also interested in, is the role that individual artifacts, individual manuscripts play in the New Testament's history. And that means not just paying attention to what the physical text says and whether it's different to what another manuscript's text says, and therefore what this might tell us about the text or the original text or anything like that, but actually what these items can tell us individually about the people who read them, the people who produced them, what that means for developing interpretations of the New Testament. And so with this article, we wanted to use Codex H, this manuscript that we've really focused on in our project, as Garrick says, as a case study, and to be able to give it its own story, really, and think about it in its own right, not as an example of the Pauline text. So, yes, Paul's letters is what we have in the text, but we were less interested in that text as text. We all know what Paul says, and that's great and fine, and there are lots of questions about it. But for us, we were more interested in this as an artifact, as an item, and what that can tell us about New Testament textual history and interpretation and preservation as well.
So there were some terms, and I think I could infer what they mean, kind of, but I wonder what they mean to this specialty that we're talking about here. So since there are four, I'll assign each of you two. So we'll start just splitting it down the middle. So and either of you can feel free to put up a finger and correct the other if you like. My mic will be muted. But so Garrett, what are fly leaves and paste downs? And Kim, what are, I'm guessing, quires and cartonnage? And again, I'll just mute my mic.
Oh man, I'm having flashbacks to class here. So fly leaves are the sort of blank pages that are sometimes blank pages. If you pick up a modern book today, there'd be blank pages at the front and end of a hardcover book. So you pick it up, you have one or two blank pages, you go to the title page and so on. And at the back, after the index, you have a couple blank pages. So fly leaves protect the main core of the book from the edges of the cover, basically. So in Codex H's case, we know that it was disbound and used as fly leaves to repair a number of manuscripts that were repaired probably at the Megisti Laver Monastery on Mount Athos by the year 1218 at least. So we have some evidence that the library was reorganized at that time and a lot of manuscripts were repaired. So this is what a flyleaf is. We still have them today when you pick up a book. But one place that you find a lot of very old manuscripts actually is, or at least parts of them, are in the flyleaves of newer manuscripts because these things are hard to repair. And the material is expensive to make. So when one manuscript falls apart or is not used for some reason, you can reuse it to make new manuscripts. So that's one. The other one was paste downs. Paste downs are often recycled material as well in manuscripts that are used to connect the text block, which is the main body of pages, to the cover as well. So it's when that last piece is adhered on to the wood cover or whatever material you're using to cover the book is connected in this way on the inside. So again, for manuscripts, this is often recycled material, but you still will find paste downs on most modern, printed books you'll pick up at the library today.
Yeah. Okay. So quires. If you think again about like a modern book and how you see the pages displayed, if you imagine you've got a sort of stack of folded parchment, basically, that you can then sort of open out into pages. This is what we mean when we're talking about quires. So you can have a codex or a book with different numbers of quires in it that you then can sort of sew into place or fix into place. And cartonnage is not unrelated to what Garrick was just talking about, actually. This is a little bit, I suppose, like modern papier-mâché. That's a good way to describe it. It's sort of scrap bits of papyri or other material that you can sort of paste to use to strengthen the covers of a codex or of a book. So yeah, these are all just kind of fancy words to describe processes that we basically still see in book production today. How do we make the pages? How do we fix them into the covers? And how do we make sure that they don't fall apart?
And just to piggyback on that too, like the quires for Codex H are really important for a couple reasons. One is that because the pages were basically folded in half to make 4 pages per sheet that you would use for this manuscript. And then the way the quires are constructed is you would take 4 of those sheets folded and kind of stack them in on each other, and then build them top to bottom. And we know how many choirs there were, at least in the ballpark, because you see choir numbers on the bottom of some of the pages, which allow us to reconstruct what was in the book at some point
Yeah.
before it was disbound. So we suspect that there was probably a lot more than just Paul's letters, which is all that there is now, or parts of Paul's letters in this particular manuscript. It's really important for reconstructing like the shape, the size, the initial construction of a book. So it actually tells us some of these technical things actually tell us quite a bit about what's happening in the manuscripts.
Yeah, and it's also the case that sometimes these sort of scrap bits of cartonnage, these flyleaves, as in the case of Codex H, they can be the things that lead to some of the most interesting questions. So looking at how any given codex was constructed, look at what's been stuffed into the covers, look at what's been used to sort of paste things to each other and to protect the main text from the covers. And you'll find other interesting texts that you can sort of date, and you can find out all sorts of interesting things about where this might have taken place, who might have been doing it, what did they also have to hand. So it's about looking at every bit of the manuscript and seeing what new questions you can find, aside of what the actual content of the codex is itself. So this was sort of part of the investigation with Codex H, really, trying to sort of figure out what all the bits of it had been used for, and what that could tell us about its travels and who had what at any one given time.
So in a previous episode, I talked to Nick Posgay about the Chirogeniza, which I think was a description of the handling of sacred texts, or texts adjacent to sacredness, that probably meshes a little bit more with people's modern contemporary understanding of what a sacred text is and how you show respect to it, where it's like, oh, they're being retired into this space because they may not be important to this individual necessarily, but because they contain Hebrew text, they need to be preserved here. Okay, but this is kind of the opposite of that. There's fragments or pieces of text that are there and they're being reused for something else. So we'll get to Macarius and that specific narrative, but do either or both of you have some way of contextualizing the difference between that kind of treatment of sacred text and this treatment of sacred text?
No, that's good. I mean, the Chirogeniza is a very special thing, and I think Orthodox monasteries have a very particular view of the sacred as well. Um, it's just a very different textual culture in this sense. So this is a remote monastic community working with limited resources to make sure their community and the other monasteries in their ambit have access to the materials they need. And so when something becomes unusable, you reuse it to keep, other works that you want to be read in circulation. So there is a trade-off in this way, and people did try to keep Codex H in use for a long time. It was re-inked entirely at some point. Someone copied over the entire text as it was fading at some point in its life. And so people were concerned to make sure that this manuscript was used for as long as possible. And kind of ironically, reusing it in the way that they did ensured its survival. The only pieces we have beside the 8 pages that are still sitting at the Megastilavra Monastery, loose leaf in their library, are the ones that were used in this way. So the disassemblage of this thing ensured its ongoing existence.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a manuscript that contains the New Testament. Your average monastery, they have several manuscripts containing various bits of the New Testament, and they're using them all the time. This is a really sort of productive scribal culture that is constantly copying these texts out and constantly adapting them for different usage. So if you look at New Testament manuscripts from sort of different places, different periods, you'll see how they've used the text in different ways. So this might be by putting liturgical markings in the margins. This might be by adding other features, other bits of information. Garrick was talking about the euthalian apparatus, this sort of extra interpretative material that guides the way you read the texts. We have examples of this in so many of our New Testament manuscripts. Like, it was an ongoing thing. Every item that was produced, I think, we have to think of its sort of sacredness as not necessarily defined by it being contained in that one object as such. Of course, we have very precious codices that have, seen a lot of expense and effort put into their production, but then we have others which are much less nicely produced and which are functional. They're sacred in that they are used in the life of the monastery. They are read, they are used for teaching, sometimes even used for practice at writing them out, and this is what we see. Garrett was describing how sometimes the fly leaves are not in fact empty pages, but sometimes they'll have doodles or practice alphabets and this sort of thing. So we can really see them as these kind of living things that have functioned in a variety of ways in the monasteries that produced them and that copied them out. So I suppose it's not that they are viewed as sort of less sacred or less important. It's just that their role within the community changes over time. So as they become older, as they become less usable, maybe the script becomes less readable, maybe they become too fragile to use, whatever the case may be, rather than just burning them or chucking them in the bin, we can sort of reuse them for other important books. We can sort of keep them there and keep them as part of the functioning of religious life. So it is a different model, as you say, but I don't think it means that they're viewed as lesser as such. It's just that there is a kind of appreciation for how the use of any one copy of the New Testament changes over time.
I think it's a juxtaposition of what is today a kind of static understanding of what the thing itself is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think for Orthodox communities, the New Testament isn't some idealized thing that can be reconstructed. It's something that's witnessed in every sort of material form, and you can never fully get your arms around it. So that's why one manuscript is sort of like, one point in a bigger pointillist painting or one frame in a bigger film about the history of Scripture. And so, you don't need to maintain every single useless thing you can't even read anymore to, maintain its sacredness in this way.
Yeah.
I think with the preponderance of my tens of listeners being in the United States, though, where, you'll come across a social media post that's like, this church burned down, but the Bible didn't burn with it. And even if not everyone necessarily subscribes to that kind of like superstitious approach to, the sacredness of biblical texts, they're exposed to it, and it is a part of the dialogue. That's more, and I think that is influenced at least in part by contemporary publishing as part of our culture, that we do think of the text as, the text that's behind me, if I turn around and pick it up, like that's the Bible. And like there
It's
are
a
much more
Bible, sure,
expansive.
yeah.
Yeah, well, you're right.
Exactly,
But also,
exactly.
hold on, unless you're talking to an Ethiopian Orthodox, because they're like 66 books. Try 80, bro.
Exactly.
but for it to be a much more expansive concept that people are engaging with is, that's kind of what I'm trying to wrap my head around. And I think you guys are helping that, and not just the two of you, but Catalin Stefan Popa and Nick Posgay, of saying like, here's how people, whether we're talking about like medieval time or Middle Ages or whatever, or in antiquity, but I won't keep going down my little rabbit trail.
No, it's much better than anything we had to
It's a
say.
great rabbit trail.
No, that's not.
Good.
Hold on, it's
that's
not.
Why we do what we do. Like literally, this exact issue that you've just been describing, that's a large part of what really drives me and Garrick, I think. The fact that it isn't this inevitable object that just kind of popped into existence, and that's really important to us. So you can talk about it for as long as you like.
Okay. But we're going to take a sharp left turn because something occurred to me today. What's that?
Slam dunk, man. I
Yeah.
love it. Keep going. Keep going.
Something occurred to me today. Like I had to run by the doctor's office and get some blood drawn for labs that they're doing because I hadn't eaten yet. So, but something occurred to me. So early on in the article, talking about Macarius, and he makes a note: 34th book on the first shelf, added by Lord Monk Macarius in the year 6726. Which, put a pin in that. I have a question there. Um, and then after that, and he also says, if anyone removes, and then in brackets, this book, let him incur the curses of the 318 God bearing, in brackets, fathers and St. Athanasius. So, look, I had an idea for possibly another Indiana Jones movie where the Nicene fathers are Nicene zombies or something like that come and attack people who, but um, so Macarius, he obviously has done something very important, and he has rebound or repaired or restored. I'll let you guys give more precise language on that. A volume of commentaries on wisdom literature. Is that a good
Mhm.
summation? I'll pitch it to each of you now.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ricky.
sir. Yeah, I think that's right. So, I mean, so that note that you mentioned from the monk Macarius, who did some serious restoration work on a number of manuscripts, and probably reorganized the library around the year 1218, is in a manuscript in Paris that Codex H used to be flyleaves on. So it was, at some point, Bernard de Montfaucon, who was a Benedictine paleographer, saw a number of pages from this manuscript in a number of other manuscripts in Paris and kind of took them out and put them together in their own little file. He identified that they belonged together. So that note is appended to a book that Codex H was flyleaves on. So we assume that that note was made when the book was restored and Codex H's flyleaves were added around the year 1218. So that's kind of how we get to our sort of surmise that by the early 13th century, Codex H was already disbound and being reused in a number of other places.
Kim, anything to add to that?
I mean, and that's a pretty good summation. Yeah. Uh, Again, just kind of what we can see in these flyleaves is, yeah, sort of really key to how we reconstruct the history of the manuscript. And there's a lot of gaps. I mean, we have these sort of little notes that we have from Macarius, and this is not uncommon. We have this sort of thing in other manuscripts as well. And they give us some indication. So I think as we've been trying to reconstruct the story of this manuscript, we have these kind of anchor points that we can trace, but there is still so much that is unknown, uncertain. For example, when the manuscript came to the monastery on Mount Athos in the first place, we don't actually know that, and we sort of have this sense of when it was likely dismantled by, because we can see when it was being reused, but we can't be much more precise than that. There's a lot of kind of gray area, I suppose.
Yep.
And we just have to sort of make our best guesses with these little anchor points that we have on flyleaves.
Yep.
Um,
I mean, we started with where the manuscript is today. I mean, currently it's in like 9 collections in 5 countries in 7 institutions or something like that. It's all it's in Russia, it's in Ukraine, Italy, France, and on Mount Athos. And so we started with what we know concretely about it and kind of worked back in time up until, when it was disbound on Mount Athos at some point. There is some circumstantial evidence that it might have been made in Palestine or Syria, but this is like very circumspect, and Kim and I don't really agree on this point, so we don't really know. Um, but so we kind of did our best to trace it back as far as we could with any level of certainty to understand what happened to it by the time it came to the Megisti-Lavra monastery.
Insofar as, so it sounds like each of you has your own hypothesis, rough hypothesis.
I have a rough hypothesis, but it's not airtight. So I mean, there's some there's a colophon in the manuscript it's a literary conceit, so it's not a real colophon that tells you about the scribe, but it connects the manuscript to the library of Caesarea, which was where Eusebius and Origen and Pamphilus carried out their work. It says that it was checked against a manuscript that was produced by Pamphilus himself, which is definitely not true because the corrections in the manuscript move in a different direction. But putting it in that northern Palestine, Syria region makes some sense because um, the colophon also appears in Syriac, which is very rare. And the first line of the colophon that attributes the Euthalian material to a certain Evagrius was erased multiple times, and multiple other people wrote in who they think produced this system. And one of the people we think we kind of can read is Nihilus Evankira, who is also associated with Evagrius of Pontus, who we know was working in this area around this time. So it's super circumstantial. It's really like down in the weeds. But putting it in that area is not, you know, I I wouldn't hold my breath, but it's not the craziest idea out there.
No, and I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I'm kind of fine with all of that. I think that that's as much as we can really say, as certain as we can be. There are other scholars who we've talked to about this who would be even more certain about that Palestinian origin. I think for me, because I've been working on the colophon specifically a little bit recently, and for me, it's really more just about a case of what's more interesting. And to me, it's more interesting not to figure out did it actually come from that location that the colophon claims, but actually for me, what's more intriguing is the sort of continuation of this tradition of associating material with the Caesarean school and with Pamphilus and other figures, because again we see this in lots of other manuscripts, and so it's more about what becomes popular in Christian tradition, and in the copying out of these manuscripts it becomes less about preserving historical fact, as it were, and more about claiming that this has a connection to an established past. And so Garrick was talking about the sort of erasure of the name Evagrius. And again, this is not an isolated phenomenon to our manuscript. Like Evagrius was kind of problematic, or became problematic. And so we see his name kind of got rid of, and other names inserted again in lots of other places. So we can sort of see these traditions at work that we see more broadly in early Christian manuscript culture in Codex age. So a while ago, I just kind of decided, you know what? Maybe it came from Palestine, maybe it didn't. That's fine. But to me, what's more intriguing is, what does the fact that this claim is sitting here in this manuscript actually do? What does it tell us about how people understood their tradition and the material?
Yeah.
So I think this is where I sort of depart from some of the sort of text critical urges to find the original text and to find where something came from. And I'm just fundamentally less worried about that, because I think it's for me, at least, not for everyone, but for me, it's more interesting to figure, what does this item tell us about the people who made it and what they were thinking about and how they understood the text and how it came down to them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I sit on the colophon. But yeah, I think Garrick's hypothesis is perfectly reasonable. I'm fine with that. So
Kim is right, though. I mean, the manuscript does want to be understood in the context of Caesarea and its sort of heyday in the 3rd and 4th century. And the broader system that it is an early witness to wants to be understood that way as well, even though it's significantly less elegant than Eusebius's canon tables on the Gospels or Origen's Hexapla or something like this that we know came from this context. So I think that is a much more fruitful way to think about the evidence that we have.
I mean, let's not beat around the bush. They're erasing the guy's name. That's called cancel culture, and I don't know why you guys won't just come right out and say it.
You're replacing one problematic figure with another, though, in all these things. So that's the problem.
So true.
Yeah. Well, again, cancel. That's what it is. history is the inquiry, not the statement, right? That's, I mean, this definitely lines up with another previous interview talking about like the evaluation, or sorry, the presence of like Persian style historiography, I think it was, in biblical texts, that you're adopting a methodology, but that the whole basis of history in the beginning was investigation. And so what you're saying is, develop an hypothesis or not, it's about the inquiry here. And I do wonder though, because it immediately triggered the idea of like pseudepigrapha when you're talking about the association with a name. Granted, it's not attributing authorship, but is there a kind of like a similar kind of nostalgia involved in wanting to associate with these other figures?
I mean, absolutely. I think you're right about the bigger point about history. I mean, history is not about ascertaining the facts necessarily. It's about using the facts you have to tell a story that's compelling and that makes
Yeah.
sense of the evidence that we have. And that's one thing we've tried to do with this manuscript, while also doing justice to the institutions and communities that still maintain it today, including the Megasti Lavra Monastery. So I think that's exactly right. But I think, the Euthalian tradition, of which the colophon is an early witness, is really still a system in search of an author. A lot of the a lot of the material is translated or transmitted entirely anonymously. The name Euthalius shows up in a number of manuscripts, but we don't know anything about this person. He's sometimes called a bishop of Sulci or Sulci, but we don't know where that is. Maybe on Sardinia or Sicily or something. We don't know. Um, so this is one of the reasons that scholars haven't looked at this material, Codex H in particular, but the bigger tradition that it's a part of, is because there's no context for it. And that makes the sort of, classic historical critical scholarship really difficult to do when you don't have a time frame, an author, a reason for doing things. And so one thing we're trying to do is to just map this tradition to give people a starting place to think more broadly about it.
Yeah. And I mean, this is kind of really evident from the fact that when we started writing writing our application for the grant for this project, we were kind of going through the history of scholarship on the Euthalian tradition. And, it's really noticeable that the work that was done quite a long time ago, the small amount of work that was done, was really obsessed with finding out who this Euthalius was. And, there were even a couple of articles that propose alternative names like Eusosius and things like that. And, like they really wanted to figure out where this came from and who this guy was. And when they couldn't, the interest just kind of died. And so when we sort of started picking this back up again, we thought, okay, like it doesn't matter that much to us. It would be really intriguing to kind of find out, sure, but there are so many other questions and there are so many other avenues of study that this opens up. And so it's an attribution to this figure, whoever he was, if he even existed at all, kind of becomes a bit secondary, I suppose. And I think it's also the case that, when we think about pseudepigraphy more broadly, which again is something that Garrick and I and many of our colleagues have thought about quite a lot, is, we sort of assume that everyone in the past believed that whoever's name was in the text, that they truly believed that that person wrote it or was responsible for it. And actually, that's really not the case at all. Like the ancients had just as much of a nuanced understanding of authorship and of how we associate texts with important figures. And you used the word nostalgia actually, and I think that's kind of really really pertinent here as well. It's all very complex, and it's not a case of it's either historically correct or not. There's so much more to it than that. And it's not just that we as modern historians, with all our tools of of inquiry, can come and shed light on this when other people had no idea what they were doing. Actually, they knew precisely what they were doing when they used these names. in pseudepigrapha, and when names get attached to traditions, like Pamphilus in the colophon, like Evagrius, like whoever it is that we're using. There are all sorts of reasons why a name might be chosen, but it's not the case that everybody that then reads that sort of doesn't understand the nuance and the reasonings why that might have been chosen. So I think we kind of want to acknowledge all of that in the work we're doing, but also try to kind of move beyond it and move beyond names. See what they can do for us, but also not let them dictate what we do and what we understand about this really kind of fascinating tradition of material that surrounds the New Testament.
I know it's probably not directly related, but I'm thinking about this because he recently passed. But I remember reading Walter Brueggemann's Introduction to the Old Testament, and there's this line that stood out to, I don't know, 21, 22-year-old Jared, that was like, not all truth has to come in facts. And that completely undermined what I had been to, which is like, no, you believe these things, and these things are, if they're true, they have to be facts, and any assertion of truth has to be a factual assertion. And that was so. I know this won't be out for a few more months, but I'm really grateful to him for that. And yeah, I guess if I get an opportunity to remember him here on the podcast, it should be for fitting into, what a lot of other people, a very large conversation that is very helpful to me and hopefully to others, about how do we accept truth without thinking that it's got to be concrete and it's completely immovable, and because that seems very unhuman. And I don't know how that would relate to our day-to-day lives. I do have a question about how you wrote the article overall. And I wonder, I asked John Depew this about his book he wrote with Douglas Campbell. Like, why not just come up with a collective pen name like the guys who wrote The Expanse instead? And I get why on an article that wouldn't happen. But were there portions that had more emphasis, like that one of you wrote and the other one kind of helped edit? How does this work when you're writing with a partner for something like this?
Yeah, we've been doing that a lot recently in the projects we've been working on. Kim previously worked on another project that we have going in Glasgow on titles of the New Testament found in the manuscripts. We wrote the article, really collaboratively. I think I drafted the introduction. Kim wrote a big chunk in the middle. I drafted the conclusion at that point, and then we both kind of just went back and forth on everything until we were happy, which made it a much longer process, but much longer than we anticipated, but a very rich thing that we actually learned a lot from each other. And the process is we would pass to the other person, read a few more things, go back, edit some footnotes, get the conclusion right, try to understand what the big thing we're trying to say is beyond just looking at the manuscript. But I found it a really useful process. It's much slower working with other people just because there's a relational aspect involved. But, Kim's great to work with. We have another book coming out that we co-wrote with some colleagues later this year as well. So, it's been a really fruitful academic partnership.
Yeah, no, it's been great. And I think, we both kind of have slightly different ways of writing, slightly different ways of working, and it's been nice to sort of meet in the middle. Garrick is really good at doing, so the tables with the pages and the numbers, that's Garrick. That's what Garrick's really good at doing. I'm good at, sort of writing a more sort of nice, flowery, coherent narrative, and making the tables sound more interesting. So we kind of both have our particular sort of strengths, and the kind of passing it back and forth was really helpful, and we've learned a lot from each other and from our other colleagues that have been involved in the project. And I'm all for kind of co-writing things. It's a little slower, but actually I think we've got a really wonderful product that would have looked very different if either one of us had have tried to do it alone.
It would have been much worse if we had tried to do it alone.
Oh,
And
100%.
our knowledge of the manuscript changed over time from when we
That's
started
true
writing
too.
to when we finished, also because we Part of the project was to go around to make new multispectral images of the manuscript because it has a sort of hidden text on each page that is the text of the lost facing page of the book. And so we've recovered, 30, 40 pages that actually don't exist in this process. So it really enlightened our knowledge of the manuscript as we were working.
Yeah, so like a lot of this came from I went to Torino to go to see some of the pages there with our imaging team, and so while they were doing their photography and working with the manuscript, I was kind of furiously making notes in the library downstairs, and then I would look at it and I'd send these notes to Garrick, and then Garrick went to Mount Athos and did much the same, and then we'd sort of bring them together and compare them against what the previous scholarship said, and then sort of try to weave this together into the story that we've ended up with, which I really like, and I think we're both pretty proud of the article. And yeah.
So usually in Journal of Biblical Literature, the articles are about 20 pages, but you got about another 10. Was that like a special dispensation because it would have cost 40 total pages if each of you had submitted an article? Like, how did that work?
That did not happen. No, the tables make it look longer than it is.
Yeah.
So God bless the tables for that. So I think that's mostly where that comes from. But we were slightly over the normal word limit, but we begged, borrowed, and stole in our editorial processes, and maybe snuck a few extra sentences in our final submission. But God bless the editors of the Journal of Biblical Literature
Yeah,
for their
they
excellent
were
work.
very nice and very patient while we finalized this. So yeah, we got away with it.
Now I want to go back and look. It's right behind me, by the way. It's over my shoulder here. I know
see
no
it.
one.
I
I know
can
no
see
one
it
can
now,
read
actually.
it.
Yeah, it's on
It's
the.
also this article is also freely available for download
That's true.
online and open
Anyone can
access.
read it.
So
You don't have to have a subscription to JBL.
Okay, so that will be in the show notes. I did not know that. I pay my subscription, so I just go
okay,
where. Um,
this
but yeah, I want to go back and look to see if there's an article that's just incomplete, like if you guys stole sentences from somebody else.
I hope so. I hope
Since you
so.
since you self-identified already.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I know that was a bit of a deviation, but I do kind of wonder what the collaborative effort on something like this looks like. I'm not a fan. I've never been a fan of group projects. I don't play as well with others as I think the two of you do. The ethic. Okay, so you mention in the article like the ethics of this process. So a question that popped up in my head is, if you're talking about one text that has been incorporated into another text, just kind of beginning here with an ethical dilemma. Do you extract the one text from the other, or are you evaluating them together?
So like if you're in a museum and you have a manuscript, but then it's got fly leaves, for example, that are from something else. So yes, okay. Yeah, I mean it depends on what your questions are of that object. Are you looking for a specific understanding of one of the works within the manuscript? Are you trying to understand the manuscript as a material object? And then you're then obligated to look at every part of it and try to understand um, how that thing came together and what it's trying to communicate in its current form. So for me, it depends on what your question is and what you're looking at. I mean, the ethical dimension we were exploring was, how did European manuscript collections um, come to be, and what were the processes by which these manuscripts left places like the Megas di Lavra and other monasteries on Mount Athos, or other Orthodox monasteries elsewhere in the time to make these collections? And the answer is it's not very clear. Um, but we need to grapple with the realities of how these collections came to be that form the foundation of our very discipline. If we don't understand how manuscripts move from place to place, we can't understand the history of what it is we're all trying to do. And, part of this influence came from the Manuscript Migration Lab at Duke University, run in part by Jennifer Knust, who's a professor there. I gave this paper as a sort of a preliminary version there. But one thing they're trying to do is understand how Duke's manuscript collection in particular came to be. its relationship to the manuscript trade, the problematic aspects of that, the sort of colonial overtones of how these things came together. So there's a whole range of ethical questions, from how do you handle the manuscript in front of you in the reading room to how do you evaluate the history of how that manuscript came to be where it is and its relationship to its previous owners. So there's a whole range of questions you can ask that I think are really important for understanding how we do biblical scholarship, how we use our foundational tools like critical editions that are built off these resources.
Yeah. And I mean, part of it is about, I suppose, sort of recalibrating to reread the history of scholarship and these figures that have been so long venerated in biblical scholarship, for discovering these manuscripts and bringing them to to the sort of scholarly world, and making sure that they are preserved for future generations in the museums and all of this. And you sort of start to realize when you do a project like this that, sure, this is the way that these people often describe themselves and their own sort of missions in their travel diaries from when they go to monasteries to get these manuscripts and that sort of thing. The way that they present themselves as these sort of saviors of the manuscripts, that if they were left to the monasteries they'd fall into disrepair, and oh no, wouldn't this be terrible, the scholarly world needs to have access to these. I will take it back to my own country and put it in a nice museum and keep it safe. And this is the sort of narrative that is often spun. But actually, this is really at great cost to the people that have produced these manuscripts, preserved them, taken care of them, and used them in the life of their communities for centuries. And so as we started to read more and more of these, these kind of travel diaries and these accounts of these, these sort of sometimes Orthodox travelers who would be sent on a mission to go and see what antiquities they could find, or sometimes sent at the behest of rich collectors who just really liked manuscripts. They would go and then they'd sort of say all these nasty things about the monks and how terrible they were. And oh look, we came away with this many leaves, and now they're safe with us. And we're only really getting one half of the story, which is clearly a very biased half of the story. And so what we wanted to do when we started working with these things was, at least to the extent that we can, try and involve the monks that still care for many of these leaves, involve them in the process, ask them questions, show sort of respect for the fact that these manuscripts are part of their life and their community. They're not just these museum objects for us to kind of play with for our, and mine for the sort of material and the questions that we have. So it's a whole complex series of kind of ethical issues, really. And again, I think really it's about sort of bringing this to the attention of our students, of other scholars, of the public, because we don't often think about that. I went to lots of museums when I was younger, and you sort of see the things on display and you think, wow, that's amazing. Isn't it great that it's in the museum? And we don't always interrogate how things got to where they are, who it was that brought them, and who it was that lost this thing in the first place. And this is really the case for a lot of our New Testament manuscripts. And so part of our kind of drive in doing this project was trying to bring some attention to that. We're not the only ones doing this by any stretch. There are a lot of scholars working on this at the moment, and have been doing for some time, in fact. But we wanted to use Codex H as a kind of window onto some of these practices, and show how it might be possible to do the kind of scholarship that we're interested in, be it text critical, be it material focused, whatever that may be, in a way that does actually involve the people who are invested in these things, not just as scholars and as historians, but as spiritual practitioners. and custodians of these items.
Yeah, I think so. While you guys were talking, I was trying to remember the name. There's a book, Gospel Thrillers, which
Oh yeah,
little bit more. I don't know. It's sometimes it seems a little griftery around some of the claims that he's chronicling in that book. But Discovering Second Temple Literature by Malka Simkovich tells some of those stories, and then I know, like I mentioned, Nick Posgay earlier in the recounting of how they got a hold of those things. There's some of that similar, just this attitude of like, yeah, we can go in and do whatever we want because we're doing it for the right reasons. And then there were
Mhm.
they were just using these, these old documents to burn and things like that to stay warm. And it's not the most believable stories.
No, these repeat you the same tropes, jam jars, windows, burning, all these same sort of
cigarettes.
things
That was one of them, wasn't
appear.
it?
Yeah, roll cigarettes,
Yeah.
all these things appear like across the literature from like the 17th century to the 21st century, and I don't there's no evidence for any of it. It's a trope of acquisition. So from my perspective, I think we need to let these things go and recognize that places like the Megisti Lavra maintain this manuscript in some form or another for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Without them, we don't have it. So I think we need to keep these groups at the forefront of our research.
How much does the effort to digitize these maybe free up the opportunity to not treat them as they have to, like, with the proprietary sense of like they need to be in this certain museum? Is there any
Yeah.
benefit there?
It depends on the holding institution, I think. So, like the images for this manuscript in Paris are free online. The ones in Torino are free online. The Russian and Ukrainian institutions are a little more complex to access. One or two of them have the images online. But like the monastic communities in particular are rightfully, protective of their materials in light of this long history of acquisition from various people over time. So, I think the more stuff online is a great starting place for anyone who's interested to see these things, for anyone who is interested to work on them. Um, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the buy-in of the communities or the institutions that hold them and the true partnership, the win-win partnership you can find between the two, then you're just doing extraction again. You're not doing real partnership. And so, building a new model of a sort of like restorative book history or something like this, I think is one thing we're trying to gesture at in this article and in some of our other work. But, these things take time, relational capital, resources from funding bodies. I mean, it's a lot of time and effort to get these things off the ground and do it right.
Yeah, and networks as well. I mean, even when we had the money to do this, um, me and Garrick couldn't just directly approach the monks at the Megisti Lavra. We had to find someone who was Greek speaking, who could, sort of help us speak to them and, make sure that we were being respectful in the way that we approached them. Um, this all takes quite a lot of time, and it's worth doing, but it's not something that you can just decide one day. I'm gonna work with this manuscript. I'll fire
Rock
off
up to
a
the
few emails
monastery.
and rock up at the monastery. No, it doesn't work like that. um, and so we put a lot of effort into figuring that out and trying to do that in the best way possible. And I'm glad that we did that. So
Yep,
yeah, I think
absolutely.
it's possible, but you need to be sort of prepared to put in the time and the effort, and not see this just as something that you are going to gain from, but from something that you can work on together with the others for whom this manuscript, this item, means a
That's
lot,
right. Yep.
and potentially means very different things than it means to you. So you have to have an awareness and a sort of acknowledgement of that, I think, in order to not just be repeating the same kind of, horrible mistakes and ways of dealing with things that people have been doing for a lot of centuries.
I think placing this within the larger context of the news stories have come out about stolen or forged or plagiarized documents on this black market, or the destruction of historical artifacts in war. So much of war seems to be predicated, and I'll just I don't know, picking an example at random. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is like predicated on this idea of culture, this very aggressively stupid understanding of culture, when what it seems to be doing is actually putting real examples of culture, specifically artifacts, potentially in danger, and things that could actually improve human understanding of humanity in its history over time. And so, I mean, I mentioned, I thought of that because one of the portions of the document we're discussing here are exist there. And so this
Mhm.
very short-sighted understanding of how to exist with one another seems to be placing in danger an opportunity or a gateway for us to come to a better understanding of one another and exist together. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You don't have to. You don't have to buy off on that. That's
I
me.
mean, I think that's mostly right. I think, we wrote the application for this project before the war started between Russia
Yeah.
and Ukraine. By the time it was funded, it was already happening. So we had planned to go to at least Moscow and Kyiv, maybe St. Petersburg also, to do imaging. So we weren't able to do that. Now we've had good collaboration with colleagues in both Russia and Ukraine throughout this process, and we've been able to acquire other images and work with the manuscript in those places in a different way. But it did make things more difficult. It's made the continuing work we're doing with the manuscript more complicated. But these are just the realities of doing business in the world.
Yeah, and I mean, I presented an early draft of this paper at SBL a couple of years back, and somebody asked me about this. You haven't been able to go to Kiev, to Russia. Like, what does this do to your project? And so, in answering this, one of the things I was trying to be very conscious of was the fact that, yes, sure, this is an inconvenience to our project, but also, I mean, that's really sort of small potatoes in comparison to the
Very
actual
small,
human
very
suffering
small.
involved in the war. And of course, this is the same, when I remember seeing in the news about kind of antiquities in Syria, for example, and in Iraq, and the same sort of stories come up time and again. That, of course, this is a very, very sad effect of war. But yeah, I would never want to sort of suggest that preserving our artifacts is the highest priority in that context. It is a shame, as you say, that
That's
they
right.
can't always be used for the type of kind of cultural exchange that we might like them to be. And for what it's worth, our contacts with both our Russian and Ukrainian colleagues at the libraries have been extremely positive, and have actually very much wanted to work with us towards the ends of helping research in this manuscript. And I think there are a lot of scholars who would say the same for work that they're doing. But yeah, it is a complicating and unfortunate side effect, I suppose.
Yeah. Sorry if I bummed everybody out.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I
it's
just,
it's
yeah,
it's very relevant to our project. Yeah, we didn't imagine that we were going to sort of have an object that had parts of it on both sides of this war when we wrote the grant. It was just not something that was on our radar at all. And then we were suddenly faced with it, and so yeah, we can't hide from it, really.
I'll turn this question over to each of you in turn. And I do kind of like to follow where your answers go, so that may take us off of the article specifically. But was there anything in the article you were hoping I would ask about that I have not brought up?
Oh man. I was hoping you would ask about the how we got the Bible versus how we got the manuscripts. We've kind of danced around that question a little bit, but that's the question I was
Well,
I
you
was
guys said so much other interesting stuff.
we are pretty interesting, to be fair.
You're
So it's
very
tough. It's
interesting.
tough. It's tough. I know. No, I mean that question. So one of the conclusions we posed is that before we can think about how we got the Bible, like the composition of the New Testament, its early witnesses, how it became a collection, its interrelationships, we need to understand how we got the manuscripts, which are the primary evidence we use to say things about how the New Testament came to be. Um, and a lot of work has been done on the early papyri. With Kim and I have been involved in another project that did work on the Chester Beatty collection in Dublin, which has the earliest collection of Paul's letters, the earliest witness to the Gospels in one book, and so on. Interesting stuff like this. Um, and there's been a lot of work done on the early, like, full Bible codices or Pandex from the 4th and 5th century, Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and a few others as well. But beyond that, New Testament scholars have barely begun to scratch the surface of the over 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts that we have. And this is one just really specific project focusing on one manuscript and its tradition, but there are literally thousands, hundreds of manuscripts that very few New Testament scholars have ever taken a look at besides an initial catalog. And they all have their own stories, they have their own production histories, their own histories of use. And I think we need to continue to take stock of this huge body of material as we also continue to look at how the New Testament came to be and what its significance is in various places and so on. So I think this is a really fruitful, open area of research that most scholars can now do even without a big travel budget, because you can find most of these things online these days. So mass digitization in the last 20 years has made this type of research possible. But we're really only starting to scratch the surface when it comes to working with the New Testament. I have a number of PhD students doing work in some of these areas, but it's still very early days for these things.
Yeah, and I suppose just sort of piggybacking off of that, one of the things that we'd sort of thought about in our pre-interview possible questions was this issue of formatting of the biblical text. And I know, Jared, you'd asked about this Greek term stikadon, sort of in lines or in verses, and you were asking about what a manuscript like Codex H, when we think about verses, does that mean the same thing as how a modern Bible would show verses?
No.
And this to me is always one of my favorite things to tell my students, because the short answer is no, absolutely not. So the Euthalian tradition, of which Codex H is our very early witness, develops its own system over time of dividing the biblical text into chapters and verses. And this is not the same as what you would see if you opened a modern New Testament with its chapters and verses and its little subheadings and that sort of thing. So the concept of dividing the New Testament into chapters and verses with little headings, as you would see in, whatever translation you have behind you on the shelf, this does have precedent in the systems that we're analyzing, but they do not exactly match up. They're not the same. And the reason that this very technical point is exciting to me, at least, is because, again, it just sort of underlines the fact that the New Testament, as we're reading it now, took a long time to come into being. It's not what it is now is not what it has always been. Presentation wise, layout wise, the way that people have segmented it and tried to understand it and tried to physically put it on the page in an aesthetically pleasing way. This is also a part of what we see when we're studying things like the Euthalian apparatus. How do I write this out in a way that is not going to give people a headache? Or sometimes in ways that is definitely going to give people a headache, but that's good because they need all this extra information. So for me, that's another sort of really important aspect that this article and our work on this manuscript more broadly wanted to emphasize. And I always enjoy asking my students to sort of open the Bible that they've got in front of them at class, or even just pulling one up on the internet, as most of them do now, to be honest, and then showing them pictures of the manuscript and saying, this in no way resembles what you have. But you wouldn't have that nice digital version or that nice edited printed version without this messy manuscript that I'm showing you on the screen. And that to me is really kind of fascinating. And just that it has a story, that it has a history, and that it's complicated and complex, and is due to the work of lots and lots of very faithful scribes copying it out.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't be anywhere without them.
Yeah. The other thing I just want to do, I know, not that you would have asked this necessarily, but I just want to shout out the people who worked with us on this larger project and made this sort of work possible. So, um, our colleague in Glasgow, Maxim Vianetskov, who did a lot of relational work with colleagues in Greece and Russia. Athanasius Antonopoulos, who's a professor at the University of Athens, who came to us with us on his own dime to Mount Athos twice to build relationships with these communities. In the early manuscripts electronic library, who did the imaging for us as part of this project to really help us gather significant new data about the existing pages that we have. So without these people, this article and the bigger project that we're still all kind of fiddling around on doesn't happen. So this is part of a bigger team, and Kim and I are just the people, writing it up in this instance.
And our postdoc as well, Emmanuel.
And Manuel Sherry, of course, yeah.
Who thankfully looked at all the frame commentaries in the manuscripts so that I didn't have to.
Yes.
So very grateful for that.
I will do my best to highlight those individuals, and anyone else you think of, just shoot me an email. And if there's, if they have a Goodreads page listing what they've written, or just,
okay.
a page with their CV or something, I'll hunt it down for the folks that you named. But if you think of anybody else, just look in my family, we sit through the credits because those people are as important to the movie being made as the people who are actually on the screen.
God bless you, sir. Yes.
And you never know, it might be like a Marvel movie. There might be something after the credits that you'd miss otherwise.
But you know what? I don't do it for the reward. I do it because I feel responsible.
You're truly
and I get a reward. Look, hey, why not signal virtue? I mean, if the alternative is signaling vice, why not signal virtue? Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I think
waterproof logic. I love
the
that.
point. Thank you.
Watertight, airtight.
Yeah, airtight too.
Airtight, even. I know.
I really appreciate the points, because it is two different points, but it does kind of converge into what I think I'm learning here with the podcast, which is it took me long enough to accept the fact that the Bible or biblical texts are cultural artifacts, and I don't think that diminishes them in any way. But what I'm learning even further is our engagement, our negotiation with biblical texts and with one another in relation to biblical texts is also a cultural artifact. And a scholar named Bradley Marsh at SBL, we were having a conversation. He's a coworker, a friend of mine. And he just mentioned, like, yeah, man, marginal notes used to be all over biblical texts. And that is a very un-American thing. Like Mark Knoll taught me. I knew it, but he told me, like, throughout the history of America, this idea of like just the plain Bible was this cultural mandate within America, and I happened to inherit that
puritanical
way of thinking.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, and it transcends that. It moves past them too. But so understanding that, like, you can't touch something without getting your fingerprints on it, and you just have to acknowledge that. And in relation to probably some of the work you did on these, you probably had to put gloves on when you pick these manuscripts up, right?
Sometimes.
What do you mean?
Less and less. Actually, like, the oil from your skin can be good for the parchment if you touch it around the edges. So it's not necessarily, you wash your hands, of course, before. But, like, if your hands are washed, you're normally okay. So I've touched a fourth century parchment with my bare hands. So, like, before.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
what a flex.
What a flex.
They didn't make me buy gloves in Torino. I touch this Codex with my skin.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah. But I mean, just on the point, like, I think, I made this point in a recent book I wrote, but also kind of in this article, is that, if you think that the Bible is inspired or revelatory or valuable in some way, then we need to take it for what it is. And what it is produced by a bunch of scholars who read all the manuscripts and created a critical edition, and then by a group of translators who took that edition and turned it into whatever vernacular language you're reading. So if we're going to think the Bible is important, we have to think the manuscripts and all their variety are important, and the change is a basic structure of what the Bible is, just like anything else that's important.
Yeah. And it's pretty hard to find a pure version of the Bible that doesn't have something in the margin somewhere. I mean, our earliest papyri, I mean, it's not as though they were written the day after, Jesus died or anything like that. Like, we're already going quite far forward before we have our earliest evidence for the New Testament, right? And everybody that has copied these texts out over the years, I mean, they weren't thinking of it as this thing that just kind of popped into existence, and therefore it was sort of completely unadulterated in that sense. I think if we sort of look at all the manuscripts in their very varied forms and the ways that people have approached them and copied them and adapted them for use, we start to see that this is in some ways a kind of strange way to think about it. But it doesn't mean that we can't think of it as inspired if that's what we believe. It just means that the practicalities of what that means might be slightly different than we imagined. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
No, it does.
Yes.
I get it. And yeah, all of this is very challenging, but yeah, it's very helpful. So again, to each of you in turn, what would you recommend that listeners read, listen to, watch, etc., to get a better understanding of textual reception, textual criticism, the things that can be derived from these early texts?
I have two things. One's self-serving, so I'll do that one second. But the
I
first
was
one,
going to do yours, so you
okay,
didn't have
good.
to
All
be
right, you do. All right.
self-serving.
I have one thing then. Uh, David Parker's Living Text of the Gospels is one of the most influential books on textual criticism for me. So that's one. I actually have two. The second one is Jennifer Knust and Tommy Wasserman's To Cast the First Stone, which came out 5 or 6 years ago, I think with Yale University Press. It's another collaborative full book by two really excellent scholars,
Who are also quite different in their own ways.
all
So
quite
another
different in their
example
own
of how
way,
they work.
who have written an entire history of the pericope adultery, or the woman caught in adultery in John, based on the manuscripts, the many languages is translated in, and so on. So these are two examples of really excellent scholarship that have influenced the work that I do.
And well, I have two others, so he doesn't have to be self-serving. Garrick Hallen's recent book, published by Edmonds, called "Words Are Not Enough," is a really nice, accessible study of New Testament manuscripts, and specifically the paratext. So all of the stuff that we find around, before, underneath, at the back of the text, and this is anything from chapter lists or little overviews of what is in the text to doodles at the back of the flyleaves. And this is a really kind of nice intro that I've actually already used it with my students. And one of them has written a lovely essay on the Euthalian martyrdom of Paul. So
Put it on the wall.
It's
Put it up,
already doing
frame
good
it.
work. So
Frame
I
it.
highly, highly recommend that. The other one that I would give a shout out to is a very recently published handbook called Working with Manuscripts by Liv Lead and Brent Nongbury. This is also a Yale University Press, I
Very
believe.
good.
And this is basically what we've all been desperate for in New Testament and manuscript studies more broadly for a long time. A sort of text that enables students and scholars who don't normally work with the material culture of the New Testament to understand some of the terminology, figure out what it all means, and start to understand why it's important and how you might do your scholarship in that way. So, yeah, a good one to have on the shelf.
Thank you. Those will be in the show notes, and they're also in my head as fuel for the podcast fire. So honestly, my favorite question that I wrap up with: what do you read for fun?
Oh, what is
And
that?
this is why
What
it's
is
my
that?
favorite
What are you
question.
talking about? Um, so I went through a Hemingway phase for a time, but when I can't sleep, I read Tolkien. So I'm on The Two Towers again. I kind of cycle through it every year uh, because the world just rocks me to sleep for some reason. So that's what I'm reading.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I read a lot of like horror and the occasional spy thriller. I like paranormal and supernatural things. So
God,
yeah,
that's much more
that,
interesting.
I
Okay.
tend to sort of go a little dark. But you know, I've also recently reread The Lord of the Rings as well. So yeah, that's also a good one.
I mean, I already intended to pass along my draft of the Nicene Zombies, whether I make a novel or a
Hey,
screenplay
Yes.
out
I
of
mean,
it.
I would watch that.
I'll
Just saying.
agent that. I'll be your agent on that.
Oh,
We'll call it
okay.
good.
Nice. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And you know what? It's that pause with scholars. That's why I like asking you guys that. And you can thank John D. Levinson for that. That's my tribute to him. I've left that question in the rotation because he's the first person who got that one. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I really appreciate you both being here. Garrick Allen, Kimberly Fowler. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. In addition to everything I said on the front end of the episode about places you can follow, like, comment, leave reviews, whatever feedback you want to give, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com with guest suggestions, episode feedback, frustrations, encouragement, or just idle chit chat. Next week's guest is Ellen DeDonker. And I am truly the beneficiary in several episodes, not just this one. I am truly the beneficiary of just following people whose bios are interesting and then finding out that they have something finished or something about to be published. And with Ellen DeDonker, it was her dissertation. And it's a very interesting topic. So, anthropomorphic representations of the divine in Hebrew and Greek Pentateuch. So here is a quick preview of that. You can hear this episode now for $5 a month on Patreon, or you can wait until next week if you're listening for free. As always, if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
So I wrote in my dissertation, by anthropomorphism, I understand the broad range of attributions of uniquely human-like characteristics to God. Anthropomorphism includes the ascription, so God is, God has, for instance, of human-like bodily, emotional, and practical aspects, and extends to more subtle ascriptions, such as spatiotemporal or interactive aspects, typically associated with human beings, now attributed to God. So a very long definition, but with certain words that I used to, yes, to underline, to include or to exclude certain terms.